Hi, I'm Renee Tucci, and today we're going to look at how to create a garland out of baby's breath. If you have the proper tools in place, creating a garland is very simple. A little time consuming, but simple nonetheless. So let's look at how we put a garland together. First, you'll need a lead wire or a lead string. I'm just using some simple twine here, and I would like to create, for this example, I'm going to create a garland that's as wide or as long as my table. So I'm going to use that as my measurement, and however long you want your garland to be is how long your lead string or wire should be. And that's how you'll know when to stop. It will also help keep all the components of your garland together. You'll also need to have on hand wire cutters and some kind of wire to bind it all together. I prefer a 24 gauge spool wire. Of course, you could use a heavier gauge of spool wire, or you could also use bind wire. But as I mentioned today, I'm going to use the 24 gauge spool wire. And the most important part about creating a garland is actually just preparing the materials. So I am making a baby's breath garland here today, and as you can see, I have quite a few pieces in front of me. So I'm going to go ahead and get them ready. And getting them ready just means cutting them apart from the stem and cutting them into a length or close to the length that I think I'll need them for my garland. So the stem length on these, and I usually get it close and then I cut it to a more precise length once I get it onto my guide wire. But I'm going to just go ahead and start cutting them into smaller sections off of the main stem. And usually baby's breath comes branched, and so you may be able to get multiple pieces out of each branch. For example, here we have one larger 3-prong branch, and here I will go ahead and I'll cut this middle section free, and then I'm going to discard that center stem, and then these two will act as a nice cluster on their own, so I'll go ahead and cut that as its own piece. So you'll continue doing that, cutting apart your pieces of material until you have a nice pile of them ready to go. I generally find that I always need more than I think that I will need, so I do my cutting and my prepping in bunches or in groups, and I think, well, maybe I've got enough now, and then I get to making it and I realize, no, you really need a little bit more, and then I'll cut a little bit more. But the trick is to have plenty of materials on hand with you when you go to create this, because it does take more than you anticipate. This same technique can be done with any materials. So for example, today I'm using baby's breath, but you could also, of course, do this same technique with foliage, which is another really common type of garland that gets made year-round in lots of different materials. In spring, you might see eucalyptus garlands. In the summer, you might see more tropical feeling garlands. In the winter, of course, you'll see evergreen garlands. Here I've just prepared a little cluster to show you of some cocculus and Israeli ruscus. So that's a combination of those two foliages. Again, I've just cut the pieces short and made them into a cluster that I would then lay into the garland. But let's go ahead and finish preparing our baby's breath, and then we'll put it all together. Okay, I've got a portion of my baby's breath cut, and we're ready to get started on making our garland. So I've got 3 smaller pieces of baby's breath here that I'm going to use to create my first cluster. And so I'm just going to lay these. As you can see, there is sort of a back to the baby's breath cluster and a front where it's more sloping and showy. So you'll want to position your pieces so that they're creating a nice rounded cluster. And then you would put the back against the rope or the guide wire. So I'm going to take this and I'm just going to hang it off the end of the guide wire, and then I'll take my 24 gauge wire and I will very carefully start to attach the wire to the cluster. And so to get it started, I just take the wire and wrap it around both the twine and the baby's breath. You'll want to do 3 or 4 wraps here just to get it going to make sure you have a good first attachment here. And so now the baby's breath is attached to the guide wire with the 24 gauge wire. Now we can move on to our next cluster. And so I'll try to find 3 or 4 similar sized pieces. That's important as we move forward here, that each cluster is consistent in size. This way you'll have a really nice, aesthetically pleasing garland. So here's another cluster that I have ready. So now I'm gonna lay this against the twine as well. I'm just gonna work my way a little bit lower so that the top of this meets the bottom of my first cluster. And that's how we're going to proceed down the guide wire or twine. And now I'll just take my wire and wrap it around 3 or 4 times, pulling it pretty tight each time. Not so tight that it cuts through the stems, because it could actually do that, but tight enough that you know it's not going to fall apart. Now I mentioned earlier about trimming excess parts of the stem. Here's a place where I would do that. I've got my wire holding my baby's breath right here, and then I've got these excess stems, so I'll just go ahead and give them a trim so that we have nice, tidy clusters without a lot of extra bulk. So I'll just continue this pattern down my rope. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the baby's breath does have a bit of a back to it. And when you lay it against the guide wire, it does become one-sided. So if you were just laying this on a table, it would be perfect. But if you're hanging it from something or you want a really lush look, I would recommend actually creating that back layer as well. So you can follow the same technique by taking a similar sized cluster and laying it. After you attach the front side, you can lay it against the back and then do another wrap of the wire to get it to stay in place. And this will help you create a really lush and rounded look. Okay, I've got a finished garland here, and it's really lush and beautiful. Once this is finished, it's easy to keep for quite a long time. Spritz it with a little bit of water or even Crown and Glory, and keep it inside of a plastic bag or container within your cooler. That will help keep it moist and long lasting. You don't want too much moisture in there because you can develop some mold among the blossoms, and of course we don't want that. But it will keep for several days if you keep it cold and a little bit wet. To finish the garland, your very last cluster of flowers will actually go in reverse. So we've been traveling down the rope here, putting each cluster in on top of each other facing the same direction. Your very bottom piece will go in the reverse of that, and that way you get a nice rounded finish on the end of your rope. I hope you've enjoyed learning how to make the garland and that you've learned a tipper technique and that you go out and create.